Hello, everybody. Good morning and good afternoon. My name is Natalie Mims. I'm with Berkeley Lab, and thank you for joining our webinar. Today, Tom Eckman and I are going to be presenting our findings from a recent report that we co-authored with Chuck Goldman on the time-varying value of energy efficiency. And before we get started, I just wanted to go over a few administrative details. First, the Building Technologies Office of DOE supported this work, so wanted to say thank you for that. And second, we are recording this webinar, and it'll be available in a day or two on the web page that should show up in your chat box relatively soon. And that web page also has links to our final report and a PDF version of the slides that we're using today. So we'll get started now. We had three project objectives with this report. The first one was to advance consideration of the value of energy efficiency measures during times of peak demand and high prices. And we wanted to do that through quantitative examples of the value of energy efficiency at times of system peak. The second objective we had was to increase awareness of publicly available end-use load research and energy savings shape research and its application to time-varying valuation of energy efficiency. And finally, we wanted to increase the awareness of and gaps in and need for research on energy saving shapes. And we had two purposes with our scope. First, we wanted to recommend methodologies to appropriately value EE for meeting peak demand. And second, we wanted to consider changes to efficiency valuation methodologies to address the changing shape of net load. Our study approach the report starts off with summarizing the state of end-use load research and existing analysis that have been done to quantify the benefits of EE measures and programs during peak demand. And from there, we go on to document the time-varying energy and demand impacts of 5 different measures in 4 locations. And our 5 measures were an exit sign, which represents a flat load shape, commercial lighting, residential water heating, residential air conditioning. And the 4 geographic regions that we chose are the Pacific Northwest, California, Massachusetts, and Georgia. And we chose these 5 measures because we thought they would highlight different system shapes and different values across the country. And we chose these 4 regions because we wanted to have geographical diversity. We also wanted systems that had wholesale electricity markets and vertically integrated electricity utilities. So we just wanted a diversity across both location and markets. And we used publicly available avoided costs from each one of these locations. And we chose one of 2 methodologies to quantify the time-varying value of energy efficiency. The first methodology was to use seasonal system peaks, coincidence factors, and diversity factors to determine peak and off-peak savings, and then apply those seasonal avoided costs to savings. Or if it was available, we applied hourly avoided cost to each measure load shape to calculate the time-varying value of the measure. So depending on which granularity of data we had, we chose one of those methodologies to quantify the time-varying value. Before we get into some of the data, I wanted to talk about end-use load shapes and energy saving shapes. So an end-use load shape is the hourly consumption of an end use. So for example, residential lighting over the course of 1 year. And an energy saving shape is the difference between the hourly use of electricity in the baseline and the hourly use post-installation of the energy efficiency measure over the course of a year. And so the takeaway from these 2 different definitions is that the time pattern of savings from the substitution of a more efficient technology does not always mimic the underlying end use. And there's some examples listed on the slide, but I'm going to go to the next slide to give you a visualization of how this shows up. So in this slide, the green line is the energy saving shape for a heat pump water heater. And the red line is the end use load shape for water heating. And so you can see in the green line, it's hitting 100% of its peak at hour ending 7, and the electric resistance water heating is at 100% at hour ending 10. And so these create very different values in electricity systems depending on when the system's peaking. And so understanding the difference between these two load shapes is important when valuing energy efficiency, and understanding how energy efficiency measures don't necessarily follow the end-use load shape exactly. And so again, the takeaway and what we found was quite important in this report is that the conversion in this slide of heat pump water heaters from electric water heaters to heat pump water heaters, they don't follow the same load shape. So moving on, we had 4 different load shapes that we used, and like I said, we wanted to pick geographically diverse locations. We also wanted places that had summer and winter peaking systems. So the top blue line is the Pacific Northwest, and it's a winter peaking system, which you can see because the line is hitting 100% in January and December. And so that's the percent of the system peak month demand. And so it's at 100% in January and December, as opposed to our other 3 systems, California, Massachusetts, and Georgia, which are all summer peaking systems. And as you can see, they hit 100% of their peak month demand in July and in through August. And so those are going to have different measures that are going to supply peak demand reductions than in a system that has a winter peaking system. And we'll see that as we walk through the system load shapes and as Tom talks about the results of the analysis. So I wanted to walk through each one of our systems load shapes and the end-use load shapes that we use to calculate the time-varying value of energy efficiency. So this is the Pacific Northwest. This first slide shows the shape of the system, and this is a winter. This is for a winter day, so this isn't the average annual. This is specific for winter, and it shows 24 hours across the bottom. And you can see that the system's hitting its peak demand at about 8 o'clock, or hour ending 8, and then also getting quite close again around hour ending 19. And so if you look at our 5 measures and how they line up with this system shape, the first measure that we look at is the exit sign, and that's on 8760. It's the flat measure shape. It creates a baseline for us to measure other savings from and values from within the region because it's on all of the time. So it's a flat line across 100%. And then because this is a winter peaking system, you see this tiny little green line at 0%. That's residential air conditioning. So residential air conditioning doesn't have any end-use shape in the Pacific Northwest in the winter because no one's using it. So this line is at 0% for our winter system. It'll be different when we look at our other systems for a summertime peaking system. And if we move on to our next slide, you can see residential hot water. And you'll see that residential hot water is quite close to when the Pacific Northwest system is peaking in the winter. And so as you'll see in Tom's slides later on, this generates a higher value for this measure than for other measures. And continuing along with the rest of our measures, now we added in residential lighting. You can see that it's a little bit slightly later peaking than when the Pacific Northwest system is in the wintertime. And we move on to our last slide for the Pacific Northwest, commercial lighting. That orange line pops in, and you can see that commercial lighting kind of looks like a top hat. It's on from 9 to 5, more or less. And that's not quite when it has, when the Northwest system is peaking for the wintertime, so it's not going to have as much value as some of the other measures. And so if we go through this same exercise for our other systems, I didn't walk through each line individually, but the big bold black line is the California system shape, and this is for a summer day. So you can see that around hour ending 18 or 19 is when the system hits its peak. And so and the exit sign goes straight across the top. It does have some peak coincidence because it's on all the time. The residential air conditioner, you can see, is peaking just slightly after the system, but still is going to generate quite a bit of value for the California system. Residential hot water is not quite coincident with the system peak in the summertime, so as a measure, it's not going to generate quite as much value. Residential lighting is peaking a little bit after the system peak as well in California, but is something that many people have started to talk about as the system peak in California gets pushed out into later hours, the residential lighting may become much more valuable to the system. And then finally, commercial lighting, again, more or less on from 9 to 5 and not quite coincident with the system peak in California. And our next system, Massachusetts, somewhat similar to California, summer peaking system, peaking around hour ending 17, 18. Exit sign, again, straight across the top. Residential air conditioning is our green line, hitting directly with the system peak around hour ending 18. Residential hot water peaking up in the morning, and then a smaller rise up in the evening, neither one which will have significant value for the Massachusetts system in the summertime. Residential lighting peaking much later in the evening than the system peak in Massachusetts. And commercial lighting, again, being on during the day and starting to slope down as the system peak is starting to rise up. And then for our last system, Georgia, again, summer peaking system, peaking around hour ending 16, 17, so a little bit earlier than our Massachusetts and California systems. Exit sign straight across the top. Residential air conditioning is that green line. As you can see, starting to peak and hit 100% just slightly after the system peak. Residential hot water peaking in the morning with a little bit of a bump up in the evening, neither one which are coincident exactly with the system peak in the summertime. Residential lighting several hours after the system peaks for Georgia. And then commercial lighting, again, just kind of on from 9 to 5. So I'm going to pause here and see if there's any clarifying questions that we want to answer. And I'm going to hand this over to Tom to talk about some of our results and the values of our different energy efficiency measures. It doesn't look like I have any questions to answer right now, so I'll just hand it over to Tom to move on to the next slide.
Okay, I see one that we have, which is the question of, are these percentages based on only? And the percentages we're looking at are the percent, in the case of the daily use, the percent of the peak demand that occurs in every hour as a percent of the peak demand that occurs in the peak hour. So in the case that we're looking at in Georgia, the simplest example is residential lighting. At hour 21, it reaches its maximum, and all the other percentages are the percent of that particular demand. So at maximum demand, hour ending between 21 and 22, if you look back at between hour 6 and 7, there's about a 30%. So that demand at between hour 6 and 7 is about 30% of what it is at hour 21 and 22. Let's see what we've got here. Lots of other questions coming in. They're scrolling through. I'll see if I can capture some of them before we move on.
I already see, this is Natalie again, a couple questions popping up about questions about the end-use load shapes and other end-use load shapes beyond the 4 regions that we looked at. And the short answer to all of those questions is they were outside the scope of the study. We really didn't spend a lot of time investigating why the end-use load shapes looked the way that they did. We really just focused on gathering publicly available data and quantifying what the time varying value of that publicly available data is. And you'll see in our recommendations that there certainly is a need for more end-use load shape research and saving shape research, and we are fully supportive of that, but that wasn't something that we could cover within the scope of this study. We also could not expand our scope to other regions such as Arizona or other locations.
I think that's a pretty good summary. There's one of the recommendations and conclusions that we have is that the currently publicly available end-use load shape information, and particularly end-use savings load shape information, is pretty thin and dated. And in the report, we describe sort of the limitations of the current state-of-the-art with respect to end-use load research. So why don't we move on to the next slide, and we'll get some summary of the economic perspective here besides just the physical impacts. This slide puts a ratio on the left-hand axis. The ratio there represents the value of the total energy, total system value to the utility versus its energy value only. So the blocks, what we have, the denominator here is the energy value alone. The numerator is the energy plus capacity value. And so you can look across locations and see that in California and Massachusetts in particular, there's a big green bar in the middle. That represents the value of air conditioning, residential air conditioning load savings relative to the energy value alone. So it's almost almost 3 times the energy value shows up in terms of the additions that it provides for saving money on capacity. Other load shapes are less dramatic, but they still are up to 1.5 times the value of the energy. So pretty significant improvement in the value proposition for certain measures depending upon their load shape. You'll notice that in Georgia, the bars don't differentiate very much. The reason for that is the publicly available information in Georgia was limited to energy and a little bit of capacity, but does not include any transmission and distribution deferred values. While in the other locations, that information was publicly available. In Georgia, they do, in fact, incorporate those values in their cost-effectiveness analysis, but that information isn't publicly available in the data we were able to discern from the PURPA filing. So Georgia will look a little bit odd relative to the other locations simply because the publicly available data there is more limited with respect to all of the utility system benefits that might be associated with reducing capacity and demand. You can see outside of residential air conditioning, the other bars are pretty much relatively somewhere between 1.25 and 1.5. In the Northwest, the value of air conditioning is virtually all energy. There's no capacity. As Natalie showed you in the graph, it was right along the bottom, 0 capacity benefits during the winter when the system peaks, and that is what causes the cost of new expansion, and it doesn't happen in the winter in terms of energy savings of air conditioning because there's no load. So its energy value is the only thing it provides to that particular system. We'll look at these individually in the next few slides and look at the components of those total bars. So this is starting with the exit sign, the flat load shape. It's the first of our measures. It's the one that is the identical load shape across all locations. So there's no change. It's on 8760. It saves the same watt as every hour as it saves all year long. You can see in Massachusetts, which is the largest bar there, the resource value in 2016 dollars is almost $170 a megawatt hour. In other locations, it's in the $90 in Northwest. In California and Georgia, again, without the transmission and distribution benefit, it's about $40. So there's a little bit of in Georgia, there's mostly energy and a little bit of capacity value to it. But you can see the other bars, Massachusetts, about a $60 energy value, and then capacity on top of that. There are, let's see, I probably should go down the list on the right of the things that are in. At the top, we have the top of the bars in color are distribution and transmission. That's deferred cost of adding additional capacity in the poles and wire side of the business. The next bar down is generating capacity for peak. DRIPE, which is demand responsive induced price effects. That occurs only in the Massachusetts case. It's the only wholesale market where we saw DRIPE included in the avoided cost, but it's a component of avoided cost. Avoided RPS in 3 other locations, California, the Northwest, and Massachusetts. RPS requirements exist in those states or regions, and so by reducing load growth, there's less demand placed on it, adding additional RPS resources, so there's some deferred value there. In a couple of locations, in 3 of the locations, Northwest California, Massachusetts, there are carbon dioxide emissions values present in the bars. There's a little value for risk in Massachusetts, California, and the Northwest. Risk is in California and in the Northwest is incorporated in another bar called the reserves or the energy component of it, not in the not in the separately identified. And then finally, the bottom bar, or bottom two bars, are reserves, ancillary services, and energy. So that's what racks up things, and you can see which of the big adders here. Carbon dioxide emissions are big in both Massachusetts and in California and in the Northwest. They don't appear in Georgia because, in terms of the publicly available data, that carbon emissions were not counted as a cost or value to utility. So that's the flat load shape. Let's move to the residential air conditioning. The value goes from relative to flat load shape. Massachusetts, the value runs up to $370 or so a megawatt hour. Residential air conditioning energy only in the Northwest, about $60 a megawatt hour. In Georgia, basically the same, a little bit for the capacity benefits, and in California about $200 a megawatt hour. So it's of all the measures we looked at, a fairly significant coincident value, except in the Northwest, and one of the highest values in both California, and Massachusetts. A big chunk of those savings is deferred transmission and distribution particularly in Massachusetts. If we look at residential hot water, again, Massachusetts being the highest case, about a little better than $160 a megawatt hour. Residential hot water in the Northwest, much higher because, as Natalie showed you in the graph, it's much more coincident with the peak demands in the Northwest, and it's a winter peaking system. In California, fairly high as well, but not as high as the residential air conditioning. Again, Georgia, mostly the energy values, not including any transmission deferred capacity. When we look at residential lighting, Massachusetts about $180, again, one of the highest values, with the Northwest and California nearly double the values for energy alone, with the capacity additions reducing the need for transmission and distribution values. Somewhat coincident in the Northwest with peak demands, less so in California, but as Natalie showed, that as changing load shape moves the peak demand later in California, that value will tend to grow. The final measure, Massachusetts, again, about $180 for commercial lighting, peaking late in the afternoon over close to the system peak, with fairly significant energy value and transmission value being offset by the addition of measures that had that load shape. Northwest, again, about $100, similar to the value for residential lighting. California a little bit less than that, and in Georgia, again, without the transmission distribution, basically an energy value alone, pretty much about $45 a megawatt hour. So as a conclusion, we've got a couple sets here. Energy efficiency measures clearly save both energy and, in some cases, reduce peak demand. The time-varying value of the efficiency measures varies by location, largely because the operational characteristics of the system, they're coincident with the end-use load shape and the system peak, and the value associated with individual components of avoided cost, and which components are actually included in the calculation of avoided cost. Those varied across the locations, certainly with respect to publicly available data. When we look at the capacity values, two of the capacity values, those of deferred transmission and distribution, are some of the highest values we found across some of the locations, but also there are also values that are the ones with the greatest range. In some cases, they're close to zero or zero. In other places, they're close to $50 to $75 a megawatt hour. So fairly significant range in the value of those. That's largely a function of the configuration of the systems. One of the things that we looked at in Massachusetts, the congestion occurring on transmission and particularly distribution in a city like Boston. A dense city like Boston is expensive to go in and repair or expand distribution networks, whereas in more rural areas in Georgia or in the case of the Northwest, those distribution costs are newer systems and not necessarily as expensive to tear up an old city like Boston. The five measures studied residential air conditioning in summer peaking areas was clearly the big kahuna in terms of value proposition. Not so much for the Northwest. when we look at changing load shapes over time, we've got the potential for pretty significant shifts due to the increase in use of distributed generation, perhaps the application of the demand response, which may change the load shapes. And so it's going to be necessary to update load shape information, system load shape information in particular, but also end-use load shapes as controls become a portion of the energy efficiency portfolio. The data we have on end-use load shapes will need to be refreshed because it will be no longer appropriate to use as system load shapes and end-use load shapes change. The publicly available data is pretty limited. It's not uniformly available across all the locations we attempted to identify, and it varies pretty significantly. It will need to be regularly updated, of course, and generally in most cases it is. Finally, the lack of publicly available information limits the ability to replicate this study elsewhere. We did a fair survey of where utilities were deploying end-use load shape information and time-varying values, and even in the locations we looked at, we had to default to some simulated data as opposed to measured end-use load shape information in order to complete the results of complete the research. So even in locations we looked at, there's a limited set of end-use load shape information and end-use savings load shape information that limits the ability to replicate this analysis more broadly. So I'll stop there and look for questions before we move on to some of the conclusions and recommendations. Now, do you have some there for us?
Yeah, there's quite a few questions. I think what might be easiest is if you look through some of them. We have some questions about carbon dioxide values in California and the Pacific Northwest, some questions about DRIPE and what that represents for Massachusetts markets. And so I think it might make the most sense for you to look through those and think about what you'd like to answer. And I'll finish up the recommendations, and then we can come back to some of the questions.
Let's do that.
Okay, great. So I will move on to the utility, state, or regional recommendations, and then we'll come back to all of your wonderful questions that people are asking. So we had 4 recommendations for state, utility, or regional that were focused on those areas. So first, we recommended that publicly available metered data be collected. As Tom mentioned, it was very challenging finding publicly available data for end-use load shapes and for avoided cost. And so we recommend gathering that data on a variety of different end uses and energy-saving shapes, and then at the state or regional level, at least at the hourly level, and then in a format that can be readily used in planning processes. Our second recommendation was to account for variations in the calculations of time-varying value of energy savings and avoided costs. Our third recommendation was to periodically update the estimates of the impact of energy efficiency measures on utility system peak demands to accurately reflect changing system load shapes, as we saw in California and to a little bit more limited degree in Massachusetts. And our last one was to study the transferability of end-use load shapes from one climate zone to another climate zone, because a lot of the research that's being done or has been done thus far is concentrated on the coast, such as in New England or the Pacific Northwest or California. There's some questions about how applicable that data is to other parts of the country and if it can be transferred depending on the different climate zones and characteristics of those regions. And it would be useful if we could transfer that data from one region to another, but there hasn't been that much research done on the validity of that. And then moving on to our last slide of the presentation, our regional and national recommendations. We had 3 recommendations here. First, identifying best practices for establishing the time-varying value of efficiency in IRP and DSM planning to ensure investment in a least cost, reliable electric system. Obviously, it's important to know how much your energy efficiency is worth if you're trying to build a least cost system. And having those values include all components of avoided cost and include different times is pretty critical to making sure that you're valuing efficiency appropriately. Second, to establish protocols for consistent methods and procedures for developing end-use load shapes and load shapes of energy efficiency measures, just to ensure consistency across regions and across the country. And finally, to establish common methods for assessing the time-varying value of efficiency, including values that are often missed, such as deferred or avoided T&D investments. So as we saw in Georgia, there isn't any publicly available data on T&D, and so we weren't able to include that in our bar charts, and it doesn't quite paint a full picture when compared to the other regions that do have that data publicly available. And so encouraging utilities and other entities to make that information publicly available and to actually include those values when they're assessing their energy efficiency. So that was all of our recommendations. Tom, I don't know if you had a chance to look through some of those questions and think about what you'd like to answer.
Sure. We'll just start walking through some of them. One of the questions was, what's the data source of the load shapes? I think that's more generic and one that we point out in the paper, but I'll give it orally as well here. The system load shapes all came from data reported to FERC. So we were looking at 8760 information reported to FERC for those utilities or the service territories collectively in the Northwest, or in the case of California for the Cal-ISO service territory, data reported to FERC for 2016. So it's for, in the case of Massachusetts, New England Power Pool information, but it's for the Massachusetts component of the power pool. For Georgia, it was Georgia Power Service Territory. For the Northwest, it was actually 2015 data, but it was for the balancing areas aggregated across the Northwest. And for California, it's California ISO. For the end-use load shapes for the Northwest, it was data collected through the end-use load shape research that was done sponsored by Bonneville back in the late 1980s, early 1990s, and through the Northwest Energy Efficiency Alliance for in 2014 residential data collection process. For the other areas, the coincident values for Massachusetts were taken from data from National Grid that they used in their calculator for cost effectiveness evaluations. For Georgia and Massachusetts, where we needed to display load shapes, that data was taken from the DOE Build America program or from EPRI, an EPRI database, but primarily from the DOE Build America program, which are simulation and-use load shapes not measured. All the references are cited in the paper, so you can go back to the original load shape information. There's a question on what is DRIPE. I'll talk about that again. It's defined in the paper. It's demand response induced price effect. It's basically an analysis of what happens to the wholesale market price when demand is reduced. And there is a benefit to all customers because the way the prices are set, it's a Dutch auction. All customers pay a market clearing price. If you can reduce that market clearing price by reducing demand and the last unit on cost a little bit less, and everybody gets the benefit of that. There's a description of that in the paper and a definition, and also a citation to the work that we use from the New England avoided cost study that explains how they derived that particular impact. There's a question on CO2 values and why the CO2 costs are different across different regions. In the Northwest, the value was the value for carbon that was used in the most recent Northwest Power Council's Northwest Power Plan, the 7th plan. It was based on the Intergovernmental Agency's cost of carbon, mid-range value that started around $40 a ton and moved to about $60 a ton. The California value was based on the California Avoided Cost Study that the PGE uses. That value was prepared through the California Avoided Cost process. I can't give you off the top of my head what the basis of that was, but the citation is in the paper. Massachusetts There's a New England avoided cost study. There are two components of carbon cost there. One is the value that needs to be paid for allowance cost under the RGGI system, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative in Massachusetts and New England. That is embedded in the energy cost. Then in addition to that, there's the CO2 cost that is the residual of damage cost estimated through their avoided cost study, separate from the RGGI allowance cost. So it's incremental above that. And those are based on the marginal emissions assumed in those areas based on the plants that are operating at the coincidence with peak. And in most cases, those tend to be natural gas with varying levels of heat rate, but primarily natural gas emissions for most of the peaking locations. I have a question: are the regional energy organizations a good source of load shape data? In the Northwest, the NEA is the one that conducted the research, so yes, the answer is there. NEEP has done some additional end-use load research, though, so they have some data there. The other RIOs I don't think have done any additional load research, so the load shape data from those is less available. They may have done, but I'm not aware of any, and we weren't able to uncover any. What's important about coincident peaks in this study? Well, the reason that there's a value proposition is that if the end use peaks at the same time the system does, then that demand is what's driving the need for additional resources to meet peak demand, both on the transmission side, the distribution side, and on the generation side. So if the system, if an end use measure is peaking like in the Northwest during the summer, and the peak demand in the Northwest for purposes of sizing equipment actually occurs in the winter, residential air conditioning that peaks in the summer doesn't contribute to the cost of adding new resources to the system because it's not causing that demand, unlike it does in the other three locations where it tends to peak very near the system peak and is a causal factor driving the peak demand in Massachusetts, Georgia, and in California. And so it has much greater value in those locations than it does in the Northwest. Then the converse would be true for resources that peak in the winter, like residential air conditioning in the morning, or residential lighting or residential water heating peaking closer to the demand in the Northwest. Let's see.
There was a clarifying question on which utilities were included in the Northwest. So, Tom, maybe you could talk about the Power Council and the data there.
Yes. The Northwest includes all the utilities covered by the Northwest Power Plan. It's about 136 utilities in the Northwest, both investor-owned and public utilities. Covers the states of Oregon, Washington, Idaho, and western Montana. As I said, the configuration of the power, it's a Northwest Power Pool with the balancing authorities that are inside the defined Northwest system under the Northwest Power Act. So again, about 136 utilities, 4 states. Don't. There's a question about, are we planning to analyze the value of heat pumps or load flattening or other things? We did not look at the value proposition going forward of what might happen if the load shapes are changed due to the factors. We point out the fact that new research would need to be done, but we didn't look at prospective changes in load shapes other than those that are already forecast by the systems themselves, where the publicly available information had avoided cost studies that might have reflected changes in system load shape going forward. But we did not do any independent look at projecting forward what measures might look like or what their benefits might be on a going forward basis, aside from what was done already by the agencies where we got the data. Could we elaborate on the ancillary capacity benefits of spinning reserves and how the factors are considered? Spinning reserve requirements are a function of the overall load level and the mix of resources you have on your system. To the extent that peak demand, you need spinning reserves to satisfy your reserve margins at peak, as well as energy reserve margins. The requirements for peak demand sizing of spinning reserves might be less as a consequence of your peak loads, will be less if your peak loads aren't as high as a consequence of some energy efficiency measure being imposed. So if capacity growth is less, you've deferred the need to add additional peak demand spinning reserves to satisfy your reserve margins for peak. So that's how they are calculated. We did not calculate those ourselves. We used whatever values we had from publicly available information. So in all cases, all the avoided costs that we're using were based on publicly available data. We did not calculate our own or make our own estimates for those. The question about transmission and distribution capacity values, these are the values, again, from publicly available information. They are not necessarily specific to a given hotspot in a distribution problem that might be downtown San Francisco or downtown Boston. They are whatever was produced for those locales in the avoided cost studies. And I suspect there are more system-wide analysis so that the distribution network is not growing as fast due to energy efficiency. There's a value for deferring investments on a going forward basis, but it's not specific to a particular hotspot in a given jurisdiction, given locale or service territory.
We have a number of policy-oriented questions that have come in about how time-varying value could be used to design integrated EEDR programs, and how regulators, if we've thought about how regulators are going to accept this methodology, or if regulators are incorporating the time-varying value of efficiency in valuation processes. And I think that those are all really interesting questions. They were outside the scope of this paper. We definitely didn't get a chance to reach out to regulators to figure out if they're interested in pursuing these types of methodologies, but we obviously would encourage them to do so. I think in terms of program design, if you are aware of when measures are going to save the most and generate the most value for your system, you could certainly think about designing programs that are going to reflect that in the incentives, as well as looking at demand response and energy efficiency together and weighing both the costs and benefits of using one resource over the other. I know that, Tom, you have a lot of experience working with, combining DR and EE together in the Pacific Northwest. So I don't know if you want to speak about that.
No, I think it's certainly reasonable for people to look at the value proposition for measures based on both their energy and capacity savings, and it might alter things like the incentive levels they're willing to offer, because the value proposition is not just the energy component of their savings. They might have the willingness to pay programmatically might be greater for measures that provide both system benefits from energy standpoint and from a peak standpoint. That's a local determination depending on the value proposition associated. Back on the regulator side, in at least the three of the jurisdictions we looked at, California, Massachusetts, and the Northwest, the cost-effectiveness determinations being made in those locales, we were using either calculators or data that are used in those locales to determine and measure cost-effectiveness. So to the extent that they are regulator-approved sets of measures and calculations, the regulators in those locales have already accepted the value proposition associated with time value, the energy savings. Whether there are other jurisdictions across the country that do that, we didn't survey broadly to determine that. In Georgia, we understand from Georgia Power that they do that internally. It just wasn't publicly available. So in all the cases that we looked at, regulators are having measure sets brought to them from the utilities that have passed muster on the basis of both their energy and capacity benefits. So there's some track record that in those locales that we looked at that's actually regulators that have signed off on that. We didn't look at the synergistic effects of both demand response and EE. These were just looking at these single load shapes in isolation. So assuming that the system load shape, that the collective effect of the savings from a particular measure wouldn't affect the system load shape more than that measure. So it wasn't an integrated study. It was applying these singly. If one looked at a portfolio of measures, including demand response, one could alter the system load shape and change the value proposition. So one of the things that we do point out is an integrated look at this rather than an isolated look at this is probably important, because as system load shapes change, the value proposition for the measures will change. And that would be true on a going forward basis through the impacts of demand response, changing technology, or the changing technology on both the load side, if you've got presence of electric vehicles, or changing technology on the resource side, where you had controls being used to change the shape of the measures themselves, and then hence change the shape of the system. So more work there, but beyond the scope of this study. I think we've covered what I see. Have you picked up any more, Natalie?
No, there was an earlier question about what component of the peak that we were most concerned with, and I don't think that you addressed that. I mean, or what range of the system peak are you most concerned with? And, the short answer is that we weren't concerned with a range of the system peak. We were simply looking at when the measures align with the system peak. I don't know if you answered that and I just didn't hear it, or if you want to elaborate on that at all.
Yeah, we were looking at 8760 benefits, and typically those benefits were concentrated in a few hours of the year, in a few months of the year. We did not have varying definitions. It was simply an economic analysis. We didn't have varying definitions of what the peak problem was for a given jurisdiction. In the winter months in the Northwest, that might be an hour, it might be a week. In the other locales, it tends to be a few hours in the afternoon most of the summer. So those are really different peaking problem statements, but we didn't address that question specifically in the study, since we were using the avoided costs published for those locales that we could obtain associated with the value of the energy that they value energy and capacity that they ascribe to those particular jurisdictions. So their particular definitions of peak, however they were derived, were what we used.
I think the only other question that I see that we maybe didn't answer was around distribution savings, and someone commented on how it seems like they're higher than transmission savings. And the question is if that's standard or if that's a result of the regions we chose. My short answer is that the distribution savings are going to be the values are going to be very localized, but I'm not certain if it's a result of the regions we looked at or not.
Yes, from the data we looked at, as we report in the study, they vary significantly across regions, and they also vary. When we looked at the New England region in particular, they vary significantly within the New England region and within Massachusetts in particular. So I think the EPA's advice, your mileage may vary on distribution savings, is a word to the wise. They can be very localized and very expensive, or they can be generalized and less expensive or zero, depending on the configuration of the system and the how overbuilt the current system is relative to load. So it's the state of the art of determining what those are is pretty varied across the country, it appears to us.
And I think that's all of the questions that we've received. So I guess we could wait one more minute and see if anybody else sends any in, but if not, I guess we'll conclude our webinar. We've got a slide up right there that has all of our contact info if you'd like to reach out to any of us. And again, the final PDF of the paper is available on the lab's website, which I believe was sent out in the chat. And the slides are already up there and available, and we'll have the recording available in a day or two. And seeing no other questions coming in, I guess we're going to wrap it up. Tom, did you have any closing remarks you wanted to make?
No, thank you all for participating. Hope that you find the report useful.
Thank you, everybody.